From 1861 to 1865, the Civil War fundamentally transformed the United States socially, politically, and economically. While the nation experienced massive change, especially through expanded federal power, the destruction of slavery, and the modernization of the economy, some continuities remain throughout all this, such as the ongoing racial inequality and debates over constitutional limits. Overall, the Civil War marked a turning point where the federal government emerged stronger, the economy shifted towards national integration, meaning like Southern economy and Northern economy kind of working together, and American society began to redefine freedom and citizenship. One of the most significant political changes during the Civil War was the dramatic expansion of executive power. President Abraham Lincoln took actions that stretched the constitutional boundaries in order to preserve the Union. He did this because the United States was in a time of war, and during times of war, the president is gifted special powers that he can use because the nation is in crisis and it needs fast action instead of going through our laborious process in Congress. For example, Lincoln has suspended the habeas corpus, which is the constitutional right to do that protects citizens from unlawful imprisonment and kind of protects their due process. And by doing that, the federal government could arrest suspected Confederate sympathizers without immediate trial, which prioritized national security over individual liberties. Again, this is justified because of the time of war that they were in. This action was challenged in Ex parte Merryman, where Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled that only Congress, not the president, could suspend habeas corpus. However, Lincoln ignored the ruling, and showing how wartime conditions allowed the executive branch to override judicial authority. Later, in Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court ruled that civilians could not be tried in military courts if civilian courts are still operating. This decision demonstrated a continuity and rather than change. And even after wartime expansions of power, the Constitution still imposed limits on government authority. Together, these cases show how the Civil War temporarily expanded federal power while still maintaining constitutional debate, which is a key example of change in continuity. The federal government also used its wartime authority to attack slavery directly, the Confiscation Acts, and you allowed the Union to kind of seize the property, which was enslaved people, because at the time enslaved people were considered property. And it transformed the war into a moral struggle over freedom and ensured that slavery cannot survive as a Union victory. And that is very important because for many reasons, because it gave the slaves something to fight for, because they were fighting for their freedom now as well. And it also prevented Britain and France and other nations joining the war because it was a war about slavery and they could not support slavery. So it was a very decisive thing to proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation. This political shift consummated in the 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States. Unlike the Emancipation Proclamation, the amendment represented a lasting constitutional change and redefined freedom at the national level. The Civil War also caused many economic changes, primarily through legislation passed while Southern states were absent from Congress. The Morrill Tariff Act was raised to protect the northern industry, signaling a shift towards federal support for industrial capitalism rather than southern agrarian interests. This was obviously met by incredible resistance from the South because, and also you see this with how the Confederates responded to this by making tariffs outlawing tariffs basically in their constitution because they wanted to preserve the agriculture and the proliferance and the prominence and the wealth that it brought to the region. And if you put more tariffs on there, it hurts the agriculture industry, which signals how the northern power and the northern Republicans wanted a shift there. The Homestead Act encouraged westward expansion by granting free land to settlers willing to farm it. This expanded economic opportunity for white Americans and tied Western development to the federal government. The Morrill Land Grant Act funded public colleges focused on agriculture and engineering, promoting education that supported industrial and economic growth. Together, these acts show how the Civil War accelerated a national economic transformation that favored industry, infrastructure, and federal involvement. And obviously, post-Civil War, you get many things like railroads and canals that are also built, which kind of support this idea of expansion as well as like a more diverse economy with industry as well as agriculture and more service-based things. Okay, with more economic changes, to fund the war, the federal government passed the National Bank Act and the National Currency Act, creating a unified banking system and a standardized national currency. This reduced reliance on unstable state banks and strengthened federal control over the economy. The government also issued greenbacks, which is paper money not backed by gold. While controversial, the greenbacks allowed the Union to finance the war and marked a significant expansion of federal economic authority. Additionally, the Pacific Railway Act funded the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, linking the nation economically and physically. This showed how wartime legislation shaped long-term development far beyond the war itself. Yes, and also when you see with the railways, it's very important that in the Union in the North, railways were more prominent than in the South, and that also allowed for better access and communication. So projects like this were in the interest of the entire nation, but especially the Union, because that increased ability to transport goods as well as supplies as well as people was very important at that time in times of crisis. Now, how about social changes? So, socially, the Civil War transformed the role of Black Americans in the Union. After the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans were allowed to enlist in the Union Army, with nearly 180,000 serving by the end of the war. Their participation challenged longstanding racist beliefs and helped shift public opinion about Black citizenship. Although discrimination and inequality continued, showing both change and continuity at the same time. The abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment represented the most dramatic social change of the era, ending a system that had defined the American society since its founding. As we continue to shift at this time contemporarily more towards a industrial society rather than a agricultural one. You see that slavery is a system that kind of built America, and now that it is becoming less and less needed, especially in the North, and where the power is kind of concentrated, especially in the Union, because that's the only place it is. The only place the Union really exists, so slavery is not needed there, and also combined with abolition movements and everything, caused a big social change. So, to end slavery and grant all African Americans and formerly enslaved people citizenship as well, which is going to come later on through the 14th Amendment. And the war also expanded the role of women in the Union. Women served as nurses, factory workers, and organizers, taking on responsibilities traditionally held by men. Although women did not gain political rights during the war, their expanded roles laid the groundwork for future reform movements, such as women's suffrage. This represents a gradual social change rather than an immediate transformation. And if you think about it in the context of the Civil War, you can look at how all the men were going to fight the war, and because there's so many casualties and there's so much demand for troops and and with all the demand for troops and everybody going to fight, that creates a serious gap and a serious lack of people to work in industrial jobs that support the war. So even though the men are going to fight the war, they would not be able to fight the war if they didn't have constant supplies coming in from the factories. And the factories and all the other, nurses especially, because they needed to be, the healthcare was still needed at this time, obviously. And all those jobs were taken up by women because, they were able, and there was also a lack of the men who traditionally served in those roles because they were going to go fight. So so the men went to go fight the war, and the women were the ones supporting it and making sure that the war could be won, right, in the factories and because of that kind of gradual step up that they were starting to participate more in society, it represented a more gradual change in how they eventually came up to be able to have the right to vote and all the other privileges that were held by primarily and pretty much only white men at this time. In conclusion, from 1861 to 1865, the Civil War reshaped the United States in profound ways. Politically, federal and executive power expanded dramatically through constitutional limits, and it remained contested as well. Economically, the war accelerated national integration through banking reform, infrastructure development, and industrial growth. Socially, slavery was destroyed, and African Americans and women took on new roles that redefined American society. White inequality and constitutional debate persisted, and the Civil War marked a decisive turning point that transformed the nation's identity, government, and economy, making it a true, for lack of a better word, revolution in American history on how the society was thought about. I mean, as the Confederate States represented that everything that America was built upon, right? The idea of agricultural society, the idea of slavery, the idea that of states' rights and being more in individual, all of that were things that kind of America was built on, especially when you look at Thomas Jefferson and his ideas for an agrarian republic and all that. So Confederate States were more of the old, and the Union was more of where we needed to go. Where we needed to go. Yes, okay. The Union was more about the new things, which was industry, which was obviously the railroad, supplies, everything. And also morally, socially, everything with more rights and being more progressive. So the Union was really a revolution in how how old America worked versus how it was going to be anew, right? So the more conservative and more reactionary how the Confederate States acted was reactionary, as they were, idealized a past that did not really exist at a certain point in time, as they wanted to be Confederate, which never really worked in the past, obviously, which is why we moved to a federalist system. But they wanted to have a confederacy, and they also wanted to have slavery and all this, and they wanted to be just agricultural. They didn't like the expansion of federal power, obviously. So all these things, they wanted to go back to a past that really did not exist, and in that way they were often violent in terms of the way that they wanted to get it, which is the definition of reactionary. Well, the Union seemed to be more progressive, and they did not like that, so they took a reactionary stance, and then they learned their lesson. Okay, that is the Civil War. I wanted to get through this entire banana. Unfortunately, I talked too much, and I could not get through this entire banana.